I was muted. 3 years later, in pandemic, all doing all things virtual, I still have to figure out the unmute thing. I was saying good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for connecting to our live chat series in Hacking HR. Excited about all the conversations that we've had and that we will continue to have with some really amazing and talented, brilliant authors who are coming to our show to share their insights, their ideas, their recommendations, the research they have done with all of us in this community. And of course, the hope at the end of the day is that we, number one, we get inspired by some of the insights they are sharing with us, but at the same time, we move into action, not just to be inspired to act, but we actually learn the tools from their research to actually act on with those tools and make change happen in our organizations. So for those of you who are connected online right now, watching this live, please let us know where you are connecting from in the world. It would be awesome to know what everybody is. So just post in the chat where you're connecting from, where you're tuning in from. And if you have any questions, comments, feedback, reactions, any resource, anything that you want to share with all of us in this community as we go through this conversation, please make sure that you post it in the chat. For those of you who are watching this in recorded format, thank you so much for being here. And I am hoping that you also check out the rest of the conversations that we have because they have all been really, really awesome. I am excited about the conversation today. We're going to be talking about culture and the connection between culture and business. And if you have followed sort of the path and the journey that we have been putting forward here in Hacking HR, you will find that in most of the posts and the content that we create, we always make the connection between culture and performance or business strategy and the delivery of business goals for us. And I'm sure we're going to be having a conversation soon. But for us, the people's success, which is done through, of course, creating great culture in our organizations, and the success of the business, they are two sides of the same coin. One can't be without the other. One depends on the other. And we have some really shocking numbers, and therefore the title of the book, Culture Shock, and the conversation of today. But about 56% of 125 million employees in the US say they don't want to go back to the old workplace anymore. About 90% of US employees with a desk and office jobs aren't longing to go back to that kind of job anymore. They are looking for something different. They are looking for new ways of working. In addition to that, and we will be talking about this as well, we've seen the numbers about disengagement of the workforce globally and particularly here in the US, where here in the US, about 7 out of 10 employees are disengaged from the work that we do. And we're going to be talking more about this, but the costs of disengagement, employee disengagement, are about $7.8 trillion for the global economy. So we got to do something about this because, once again, going back to what I said before, creating a great culture for employees to be engaged is one side of the coin, together with how that impacts the results that the business is trying to achieve, and of course, the profitability and longevity of the organizations they work for. So I am very, very excited about this conversation, and I'm going to be welcoming Jim to the screen with me right now to kick this off. Jim, good morning. How are you?
Hi, Enrique. Great to be with you. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you so much. Very excited about the conversation. And once again, I want to tell everybody who's connected online right now, if you have any questions, if you have any feedback, any comments, and reaction to our conversation, please make sure that you post it in the chat. I am hoping that you go and get the book, a copy of the book, Culture Shock, by Jim and his co-author. Great insights. So, Jim, let's begin here for our community who's watching either live or this recorded video. Can you please introduce yourself to let us know more about who you are, the work you've done, and anything else that you, of course, want to share with the community?
Sure, Enrique. Again, thanks for having me on. My name is Jim Harter, and I've been with Gallup for coming up on 38 years here in November.
Wow!
And
congratulations! Wow, that's quite a tenure.
Thank you. I know it's kind of rare anymore. people bounce around a lot, and there's advantages both ways. But I get a chance to work with a lot of different organizations and accumulate a lot of information. Work with our team to with the goal to understand what works inside of organizations, the people part of management, and how we leverage people, and inspire people to have great careers and great lives in at the same time that we're improving business. And so I think those two things can go together if we get it right.
Yeah.
And it's never been more important. I think that the role of managing, it shows up in the data, and the role of leading is more difficult than ever before right now, but also more important to get right than ever before. And I like to work with our team to look at the complexity of the data, but also to bring it down to the core essence of what we can do with it to create change. So
Yeah.
really, from my perspective and what I work on, it's about taking science and making it useful and meaningful inside of organizations so that we can create change. And during this I call it forced working experiment through the pandemic, we learned a lot. And I think we can make workplaces better than ever if we get it right.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I'm with you in there, and I am hoping that you share some of the insights on how to do that. But I want to begin here with this question. I looked back at the research Gallup has done over the past 20 years on employee disengagement, and the numbers have remained surprisingly about the same. Yes, there's a little bit more disengagement, a little bit less disengagement, a little bit higher productivity, but nothing has significantly changed either engagement or productivity over the past 20 years. Why is that? And I ask you this question, especially in the context of all this conversation about whether we can be productive working remotely or we have to go back to the office. Uh, because, I feel that it's strange that now it seems that we're really worried about engagement when people are working remotely, but the numbers have surprisingly remain about the same. So why is that? Why have we been pretty much at the same level for the past 20 years?
Well, you look at the data in aggregate, and those aggregate numbers are hard to change because it represents a lot of people, a lot of
Mm,
organizations. They're going different directions. We did see an increase both in the U.S. and globally for about a decade. Um, so if you look at the global numbers, it started off about 12% and engaged
yeah.
in 2009, come up to 23%. So, but we saw it in the U.S. We saw a decade of growth and engagement. Again, as you mentioned, slow growth. It isn't like a massive change you see in the aggregate population, but it has a lot to do with. And now we've seen a dip in the U.S. And now we're starting to see a little bit of a comeback again. But your point that it's been in the 30% range in the US for quite some time, 20% range globally for quite some time. The problem is we don't have enough organizations leveraging what science says actually works. And
Mhm.
that means we need to upskill managers to be more like coaches than bosses if we want to get this right. And we've really dug into, breaking that down into, what is the essence of coaching. But if we get that right, we've studied organizations inside that aggregate pool of workers across
Mhm.
the world that have 70, they average 72% engaged employees, and they didn't start there. So there's a lot of hope inside those numbers that don't seem to be changing too much, um, because we've seen it work. We've looked at organizations that have actually improved and done it right. And so the inspiring thing I'd pull out of all that is that inside those aggregate numbers, there are a lot of organizations that have made huge improvements and that's enabled them to have resilient cultures during tough times.
Mm.
And they held their own during
Yeah.
the pandemic. They've held their own during past recessions, and it gives them a huge advantage because they've got the people working with them instead of against them when
Yeah.
times get tough.
Yeah, absolutely. Jim, let me ask you this. Is there any industry that you are particularly excited about when it comes to the improvement of their engagement numbers and therefore productivity levels? And is there any other industry that you're particularly concerned about in terms of whether they are staying either the same or declining in engagement?
Well, that's the interesting thing in the data is that it has so much more to do with what managers and leaders do than industries. We see in
Mm,
production jobs, engagement tends to be a little bit lower, but they're high production organizations that are at the top of our database. So, and financial industries have grown a little bit quicker. Some of it has to do with, when you have organizations that are naturally built with smaller teams, you can grow a little bit faster because
Yeah.
the managers can have a bigger impact on those smaller teams. On the other side of it, though, if you've got smaller teams, if you have bad managers, you also have a chance to disengage them more quickly. So it goes both ways, right? But you can create more change if so. There is a span of control issue, I think, that's important to take into account, particularly when people are now more remote. The thing I would keep in mind with industries, so we got about half the people. Let's just take the U.S. for instance. About half are in jobs that just can't be done remotely. The other half are again aggregate numbers. The other half are in jobs that can be done remotely, and it ended up being more than we thought it was. But both what workers have learned over the past several years is that they want something really bad that they wanted even before the pandemic, and that's flexibility. Flex time was the most desired perk. And so we've got to figure out ways to build that concept of autonomy and flexibility into any job, whether it's a job that has to be done on site or whether it's one that can be done partially remote. But we can't just leave it at that. If it's just about autonomy and we have no accountability and we have no good managing where managers are actually in touch with people and having meaningful conversations, that won't work. In fact, it'll go the other direction. So we've got to honor that learned need for autonomy, no matter what the work situation, what the industry is. But at the same time, have great managing where people are being coached and managers are in touch with people and they're setting clear direction and giving them feedback when they need it and having high accountability so people know how well they're doing.
Yeah. Is it too much of a stretch to say that managers, direct managers and leaders are the first ones that we should be looking into when we talk about improving engagement numbers and productivity numbers? Are they the ones that we should be focusing on to ensure significant improvement of these numbers?
Absolutely. That's the if you're going to point to one factor that every organization can do something about and change and impact with regard to how engaged employees are and thus how productive their employees are or whether they're likely to stay or leave. It is 70% of the variance in team engagement comes right back to the manager. And I'm talking about managers at all levels. And that starts with leadership and the people that report directly to senior leadership. And then it cascades from there. But leadership does have to take a serious look at their strategy. What do they want their culture to be? And how does how they define engagement fit into that cultural aspiration that they want their organization to be? So there's got to be a clear definition around that first. And that's got to be well communicated inside the organization. And we've also got to make managers' jobs simpler. Managers have too many things coming at them. They're trying to manage leadership aspirations at the same time. They're trying to manage people in different work situations right now. And they might have a performance management program in one part of the organization they're trying to manage to. They might have an employee engagement program. They might have a wellness program. They've got all these things coming at them. And we've got to make their jobs simpler, but we can do that if we get to the essence of what managing is and teach them the right skills so that they can leverage the strengths of each person that they manage. And that strengths component is really important because it just builds efficiency into how we manage others. Every one of us are different in one way or the other, and we got to know that first.
Yeah, and I want to talk about those strengths and some of the top skills that they themselves can build for themselves to be better leaders and better managers, but also the efforts that the organizations and HR can do to build and upskill and reskill them around those skills. But before that, I actually want to ask you this, and this is empirical, by the way, but I'll say it, right? When you go and talk to a manager, you go to talk to a leader, and this has been my experience. You tell them, you got to give your people autonomy. You also have to make sure that they are accountable, so they have to know what their goals are and how you're going to measure those goals. You have to communicate with them. You have to trust them so that they can trust you. And there's never been lack of understanding that this is true, that this is the way to go. They never say, "Oh, I don't understand," or "I don't think that that's true." But when they go to the actual implementation, the delivery of building trust, the delivery of creating a culture of autonomy and flexibility, and also communicating properly around goals and metrics, that's when things start to fall apart. Why? Why is it that they actually understand that these things matter, but when they go to implement these strategies, so to speak, there's either a failure or maybe there's not really a full buy-in from them to actually make this successful?
Well, I would argue it's we just don't build in the right habits
Mm,
for effective leadership and managing. And the most important habit that we found is for every manager or leader to have the goal to have at least one meaningful conversation with each person every week. Very
wow.
few people are getting that.
Yeah.
If you just said do one thing, have one meaningful conversation with each person you manage every week. But then again, we've got to kind of break down what that means, right? Because I can't just have a forced conversation, expect it to be meaningful.
Yeah.
What it means when we ask employees, did they have a meaningful conversation? By the way, the people that say they had an extremely meaningful conversation with their manager in their last conversation, 80% of those people are engaged. So you go from those global numbers we're talking about to 80%. You never see that, but
No.
it happens through that action. So our team broke down what meaningful conversation is from the perspective of an employee. And one factor that came to the top was recognition.
Mm,
And there's some low hanging fruit in here that people are just not paying attention to. One of them is only 10% of people are even asked how they like to be recognized. You
wow.
10%. So it's
Gotcha.
easy. Anybody can do it. People just aren't doing it. They're assuming that people are like them, maybe, or assuming how people want to be recognized, or maybe not even in touch with what people are doing so they can recognize them effectively. If I just say, Enrique, you're doing a great job, is that good enough?
No.
No,
No.
because I don't have no idea what you're doing.
Yeah.
So if you have to first know what the individual is doing, and you have to know that, and that includes getting feedback from their peers, which is the second thing that came up is discussion of collaboration with their peers. But when managers are in touch with their peers, they know they get feedback from an objective third party on how they're doing, and they can tell them this person was really appreciative of what you did there. Or and sometimes it's a skip level kind of feedback where maybe a manager of a manager communicates back to an individual that they heard how well they were doing. That means a lot to people. And if
Yeah.
you're specific about what it was and how that work ties to the ultimate outcome, which is serving our customers, that's not being paid attention to enough right now. The third area was goals and priorities. They said when I had a meaningful conversation, my manager discussed with me my goals and my priorities and adjusted them on the fly when they needed to, instead of waiting 6 months or
Yeah.
however long. So it was more relevant because it's in the moment. Strengths was another part of the conversation. So does my manager know me for who I am? Is that the starting point, or do they just assume that I'm like everybody else? So we've got a cool tool called Clifton Strengths that's been used by over 30 million people, and it helps through science to identify each person's strengths so that we can be more efficient and how we have more efficient conversations and talk to each other more efficiently. The time of the conversation was also important. You can have a meaningful conversation in 15 to 30 minutes
Yeah.
if you focus on the right content, Enrique. So those are some of the kind of top of mind things. We can't forget about the customer component, though. If all we're thinking about is what works for employees, and we miss out on how that affects the end result that we're trying to achieve through customers, then we really miss out on the ultimate goal of the organization, and that's that we're serving somebody.
Yeah. Are we then missing out on perhaps providing more uh, maybe more tactical advice to these managers in telling them engagement is not this blurry thing that HR talks about. Engagement is you having a 15 to 30-minute meaningful conversation with your direct reports that has these 4 or 5 different components, and you yourself for your own growth having this kind of conversation with these 4 or 5 components with your peers so that you know how you're doing. Are we
Mhm.
missing out on the practicality of what this means?
There are simple truths in the research that just get buried in the journals that we need to, one of my jobs is to help our team pull those things out and work with other practitioners in the field so that we're making it useful. When I said making managers' jobs easier, it doesn't mean that their jobs will be easy necessarily, but
Yeah.
we're trying to create shortcuts for them through the science so that they do have tactical, practical things they can do. And that's one of the big ones is make sure you have that habit. If you don't have the habit and you don't have the cadence of weekly, you've got to backtrack, and so your conversation's got to be longer, and
Yeah.
it feels more like a chore. Enrique, I actually went through. We've been studying managers for decades, and I went through all the different job responsibilities of managers that we've listed off as we study them in depth. And every one of those responsibilities actually gets easier if you have a weekly conversation with somebody. People say, well, you're adding one more thing on to what I'm supposed to do. No, well, you're
Mm.
actually making everything you're supposed to do a lot easier,
Mhm.
because you've got a cadence where you understand each person better than you ever have before, and you can give them better insights. You can give them better recognition. You can you can know more quickly whether they should be in a different role than they're in now.
Yeah.
And you don't know that unless you're in touch with people. And when we're in a more hybrid work environments now, it's even more essential. And the risk in hybrid is great too. So it isn't just autonomy leads to great levels of engagement. There's a risk of burnout in hybrid if we don't have those kind of rituals and habits in
Yeah.
place so that we're in touch with people.
Yeah, I remember years ago. This I have never forgotten about this. But I was in a meeting where, you know, I was a practitioner of HR, and we were talking to this leader, and we were telling him, well, you got to give your direct reports ongoing feedback. And he said, I don't have time to get feedback. And my boss, the CHRO, told him, yeah, but that's your job. I mean, like, then what is it that you're doing? I mean, your job is to make sure that you have these conversations with your team so that how they're doing, where they're going, what they need from you, what tools they're lacking, what they're doing well, so that you celebrate, like you said before, you celebrate and recognize kind of like, that effort and those outcomes. So it really kind of like, it was a little shocking, to be honest, to hear a leader say that they didn't have time for that. And when we dug a little deeper into this particular leader, and we found out that what had happened was that person was a very technically proficient individual contributor who never wanted to be a leader, but there was nobody else to lead that team. So he was promoted to that role, something that he never wanted. And in that role, which was supposed to be a people leader role for him, he ended up doing maybe 10% of people leadership, and then 90% of the same technical work that he was doing when he was an individual contributor, which ended up setting him and the entire team for failure rather than for success. So any comments about kind of like that career management design when you end up promoting people that may not want to be where they are? It's just there's nowhere else to go.
Yeah, and unfortunately, people learn that the hard way.
Mm,
The top two reasons that managers give us for how they got into their job of manager are: one, tenure in the organization, and two, I was highly successful in an individual contributor role. So we think the natural course should be, and it seems equitable on the surface, but it doesn't work out very well always. That they should then become a manager, and there's some natural draws to that. One is we've traditionally paid managers a little bit more than what we pay individual contributors, and so they feel like they're reaching a higher status. We've got to change that. Individual contributors that contribute, that build huge expertise in the organization, should be rewarded for continuing to be individual contributors into the future and have high esteem for those jobs, because they're so important. So you pull that strength away from somebody, put them into a non-strength role, and they get frustrated. Their coworkers are frustrated, and it doesn't work out too well. So the selection component of it is very important. We've studied that in a lot of bit of depth too. Probably don't have time to get into the details of that, but we've studied the traits that lead to effective managing. So half of it is how you pick who goes into that role. Some of it you can learn just through we call it game film, just putting people in positions where they have a chance to lead teams before they get into that role. The other is through a systematic selection process where you actually identify the traits ahead of time, and
yeah.
you know who's most likely to love that role. The complexity of people. People are messy, and they're
It's
they're
hard.
all individuals, all different. Some people find that a challenge. Some people can't stand it. So you
Yeah.
got to know that difference, and it's too bad that people learn it too late.
Yeah.
So there are ways to figure that. Half of it is figuring out who should be in the role. The other half of it is giving them the right skills so they can be an effective manager, like we're talking about with the meaningful conversations.
Yeah. Yeah. Let me go back to something that you said before when you mentioned that a direct manager, a people leader, right? I mean, there's a million books about leadership, and every day there's you got to learn this new skill, you got to do this new thing. So there's the burnout itself that comes with working with people, which is really hard to do. And then there may be a perceived level of burnout when you realize that this little bit of all the things that you're being bombarded with: information, new skills, new activities, new things to do. Why would anybody want to be a leader in the first place, knowing that you have to work with people, that is already hard, and now you got to learn all the things that you don't know, but it's a lot of them. So how do you manage kind of like that reality as a leader?
Well, yeah, and that's why managers in particular are showing increasing levels of burnout because they've got a
Hmm.
lot coming at them. And I think
Yeah.
our role, in terms of the kind of work that we do, is to make their jobs. Uh, I keep saying easier, but just more efficient. We've got to
Yeah.
make their jobs more efficient so it's easier for them to deal with the idiosyncrasies that they deal with every day. Um, and equip them with the right tools. Strengths is one of them, so they know why people are the way that they are.
Yeah.
That's a shortcut to having good conversations with people, but also to to help them know your main job. Yeah, it's to have a meaningful conversation every week, but it's also three things. It's helping people set goals and priorities. It's having those ongoing conversations with a cadence, and it's having a high level of accountability where people know how well they're doing from an individual performance standpoint, know how well they're doing from a team collaboration standpoint, and they get some feedback on how they're serving the customers that the organization is serving, whether that they're direct or indirect customers. But then there's also the part about, managers are in the only position, and leaders are with the people they directly manage, um, are in the only position to know those differences from the individuals, to know what's going on in their life, where they can know those kinds of things, and to have the kind of conversations where they can accommodate work and life. One thing we found, Enrique, in our research was that there are people who prefer to have a blended work life, and there are people who
Mhm.
prefer to separate work and life, and we call them blenders and splitters. And it surprised me that half of people reported that their best life imaginable was when their work and life are split or separated. The other
Mhm.
half prefer their life to be blended. And if, as managers and leaders, we don't know that about somebody, and by the way, both groups can be highly engaged and productive if we manage them the right way. But if we don't know that about somebody, we can easily ourselves become burnout because we don't understand why why someone isn't in the office at a certain time, or why somebody isn't responding to an email on a weekend or on an evening or something. And but if we know that, we can set the right expectations,
Mm.
and we don't offend people. We don't treat people with disrespect. Which, by the way, people who there's not a fit there, where let's say they're a splitter, but their manager, their job doesn't really fit that kind of lifestyle, they're more likely to be burnt out.
Yeah.
And the reverse is true as well. So with blenders, so there's little things like that that can reduce burnout if we just take the time. It doesn't take much time to understand how someone's work and life works best for them, and that can change depending on where someone is in their life situation,
Yeah. And you
whether they
and,
have kids at home or not.
and you said a while back that we have to instill the right habits, right? And
Hmm.
we know that any new habit requires perhaps extra energy at the onset, at the very beginning, and then from there, well, it becomes a habit. And I'm guessing that for a lot of these leaders that you talk to, for example, the meaningful conversations once a week, 15 to 30 minutes with the components that you mentioned before. For a lot of these leaders, this may be something completely new that they will have to,
Hmm.
I'm gonna say it in air quotes here, force themselves by putting it in the calendar, saying I have to have the conversation with Jim every Thursday at 1 p.m. And then eventually, after I don't know 3 months or whatever it is, that every Thursday at 1 p.m. you have the conversation with Jim. But there has to be that level of a conscious effort and intentionality to make sure that becomes a habit in you if it's not already.
Yeah, and it can seem. Let's say you're a manager who's managed a team for 5 years and you've never done that before. It might feel pretty awkward initially to
Yeah.
just start talking with everybody once a week when you've never done that before. But there are ways to make that a lot more comfortable. And you've got to explain why first,
Yeah.
because people need to know why. But also, and I've said this a couple times, but knowing their strengths builds trust in a different way, because you're opening up, here's my strengths and why I am the way I am. Here's yours. I know you in a different way than I ever have before. And we
Mhm.
can have a different conversation than we've had before. We've also found, though, that um, teaching managers and leaders some foundational just insights on what the research says engages people, on what the research says is good performance management in a simplified way, and why those two things are not different. They're actually together. Um, and they're not separate things. And then blending strengths into that, and then you got to on top of that, have a little bit of practice.
Yeah. Yeah.
People need to practice, and we give them a lot of times sample questions to ask their employees, but they need to practice having meaningful conversations with people, and know what kind of questions to lead with, and then they also can get feedback from their peers
Yeah.
on what's working for them. I think peer
Yeah.
conversations are a big component of that as well, but it takes a little bit of practice. But once what happens though is, Enrique, when they get that practice, light bulbs start going off, and they're like,
Yeah.
I just got ahead of an issue that I would have never known about that
Mm.
we need to solve. Or I had this person completely on the wrong track when I would have had to correct it 6 months later.
Mm.
Um, or this person actually did some work that I have never recognized them for before that had a big impact on our customers. You don't know that unless you have those conversations.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, I love
Or
that.
or this person's a splitter. I didn't know that. They
Yeah.
like to split their work and life, but they're one of my more highly productive people.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I love that. And uh, once again, shows the value of having those conversations, even if it requires, conscious effort at the beginning until it becomes that kind of habit that we're talking about. Jim, what do you see the role of HR leaders, HR practitioners in facilitating the emergence of this kind of culture that you've been talking about? What do you see their main influence to be, to make sure that both leaders and people can work this out together?
HR leaders are essential because they provide the resources. They should provide the right resources and provide simplified methods. I think too often uh, we have different parts of the organization that are putting things on managers that could be blended together easily that aren't.
Mm.
I mentioned a few earlier performance management programs, which traditionally have happened like once a year, and
Yeah.
they're kind of awkward reviews that happen that haven't been very helpful to a lot of people. That it doesn't have to be that way. Performance management should be embedded inside your engagement model. Um, Learning and development should be consistent with the same kinds of things. How about DEI? Why is that a separate thing from engagement concepts, which should be all about respect and
Yeah.
caring about people and knowing people for their strengths? That's all blended in there as well. So I think a role of an HR leader is to pull these various things coming at managers together into coherent framework that makes managers' jobs more efficient and provides the tools. And so HR can play a huge role in providing the right
Yeah.
tools and in synthesizing information. So it's all, everything I just talked about that hasn't worked has been well intended. So I'm not
Yeah.
saying it's not well intended work. We've just got to do a better job of pulling the pieces together, and we can do that. We've seen it happen.
Yeah, absolutely. Jim, as we get ready to wrap up our conversation, I want to ask you a last, maybe two-part question, right? But we're going to use this to wrap up our chat. Uh, for those leaders, this engagement cost $7.8 trillion to the global economy. That's very far from what we do in our business, right? If I'm a leader of a 5-people team, maybe this engagement costs my team $100,000 a year, not, $7.8 trillion is a number that is very far away from what happens at the level of my team. So
Mm-hmm.
for those leaders who don't believe necessarily that there's an impact of from the cultural perspective, there's an impact on the delivery of the results in their teams, from their teams to the business. What do you say to them? What do you say to those leaders who still don't believe that there's a connection between culture and delivering results? So that's part number one. And part number two, what do you say to leaders that do believe that this is true, but they are perhaps failing to connect the dots for their people and tell them, hey, Enrique, if if we don't have this meeting on Thursdays at 1 p.m., which is our meaningful conversation every week, this is how our customers may be impacted by the lack of not having this meeting. And I'm using just that basic example. How can leaders connect those dots between what people are doing and how that impacts business and customers?
Okay, I'm going to try to answer both of them with one answer. See if this works. So we have actually put together through our meta-analytic research an algorithm that shows these connections. But I think the statistics alone, even though they're highly substantial, we've got to conceptually describe why the connections exist. So one statistic is teams that are more highly engaged have 23% higher profit than teams that are not engaged or are actively disengaged. So I'm talking top to bottom quartile comparisons, 23%. Why does that occur? Well, it occurs because teams that are more highly engaged look out for customers. They're more likely to stay. That saves the organization money. Turnover costs money. It usually accumulates to large amounts of money, and it affects customers because they have less reliable experience. So we developed this Gallup path that kind of takes it down from earnings all the way down to the number one predictor of earnings is customers, repeat customers, and new customers. And customers have to be engaged. And right now, the American Customer Satisfaction Index has been showing a decline in that. And we can directly link that to how engagement has declined recently. And so there's that. And then you look inside the organizations and you ask employees, do they feel responsible for the quality of service customers receive? That's been declining, particularly for remote workers. And for fully remote workers, people are less connected to the mission or purpose of their organization. That's been declining. So we've got to be in touch. That's a really good reason to be in touch with people and to have a culture, even if people are not together all the time. But you go down that path, and the best predictor of customer engagement is employee engagement. It's for the reasons I just noted, that if employees are quietly quitting or don't feel like they're connected to the ultimate aims of your organization, they're not going to put in discretionary effort to help out a coworker when they need it. They're not going to look out and do those discretionary things that customers need. It's almost impossible to just do your job because almost every organization has values. They're trying to do extra things for customers. You can't predict all that. So engaged employees do that. But then how do you get employees engaged? Well, you got to have great managers who put people in positions where they can do what they do best. And that's that coaching component. So if you take the path all the way down, look at all the linkages from all the meta-analyses we've conducted. And by the way, we put those all in the appendix of Culture Shock for anybody that wants to nerd out on that stuff. It goes from great managers to getting people in the right roles, to high engagement, to customer engagement, to repeat business, new business. And that's the path that actually works. And it works reliably, has for some time. It's never been more important than it is right now because we've got a different work environment than we've ever had. And it's probably not coming back. 90% of people want more flexibility. So we've got to have great management inside of that model.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. Well, Jim, thank you so much for spending this time with me, with our community, and sharing all these amazing insights. Of course, I hope that all the HR leaders and practitioners who are tuning in now live or in the recorded video, a lot was said in this past half an hour. So make sure that you, number one, get inspired, because I think our role has always been incredibly important, but now way more important than ever before, for us to be able to connect those dots for people, for leaders, for teams, for managers, and that you act on it. That you go ahead and make sure that you start by doing one thing. Maybe even you in HR having that meaningful conversation with your peers and your teams. Maybe that's the beginning of the beginning here. But I'm hoping that you act on all these incredible insights that Jim shared with us. So, Jim, thank you so much for spending this time with me and the community and sharing all the insights today.
Thanks, Enrique. Great to be with you and everybody else.
Thank you so much. And thank you, everybody. I'll see you soon in the next edition of our Hacking HR live chat series. Thank you so much.